Welcome to First Formation and Gruntworks, and specifically the GruntGod Season Pass, Episode 7. This chapter talks about St. George of Cappadocia and martyrdom. I don't want to say when this was recorded. I will say that martyrdom is particularly relevant in the United States and has been for a while. What it means to bear witness to something and the extent to which that assumes or requires death at someone else's hands. Um, and I kind of do want to mention the timing because if you are watching this instead of listening, you'll see I'm in front of a chalkboard with some books in the background, and that is because I am recording from Gruntworks' own brand new bookstore, the Chapter House in Albany, Oregon. You can check out pewpewhq.com/bookstore to learn more. The bookstore is going to be opening to the public formally on November 11th, 2025. That's Veterans Day. And GruntGod has been releasing a new podcast episode and book chapter every week since the beginning of August. In October, we're going to be having GruntCon on the 25th of October, right here at the Chapter House in Albany, Oregon. On October 25th, 2025, a church service about church and service for high church lowlives. Come check it out. We're going to be talking about the Bible. We're going to be talking about each other. We're going to be talking about resources. We're going to be talking about martial hermeneutic and what do we do as military families and rank and file believers in a system, in a world, in an institutional church that doesn't really seem to know what to do with us. Sometimes, I know it's been said, I don't know by whom, but sometimes it's easier to give birth to something new than it is to raise something from the dead. And so GruntCon and GruntGod and the Chapter House are all kind of in the mix of what the institutional church would call Gruntworks, scare quotes, ministry. And I say that with scare quotes because I was docked in an application essay for never mentioning the word ministry when I applied for my MDiv. And it just never occurred to me to use that language. It doesn't really resonate with me because I don't want to be ironic, but it feels ironic from where I'm sitting spiritually and also literally to say, I don't know if what I'm doing and what I believe fits inside the existing institutional and post-industrial church. And so GruntCon, GruntWorks, GruntGod, the Chapter House, those are all pieces of a vision that I have that are all unified under GruntWorks. But each kind of speaks a specific kind of thing into being. And at the Chapter House, it's about Tolkien, it's about wonder, it's about story, it's about adventure, it's about a place where you can go to kick off your boots and feel finally at home, whether that's the Shire or whether that's on the battlefield. I don't know. A lot of people still might feel like they're in the fight. And I certainly may have I've said that I kind of retired or that I'm stepping back, and I definitely am. The Chapter House is going to demand a lot of time and energy, but this is an outpost, an operating base for human dignity, for civil rights, for social justice. And so that we're talking about, I'll say it's Monday, September 15th. I will not say what problematic event just occurred last week in which martyrdom and the creation and propagation of martyrs is at the top of everybody's minds, and not necessarily the people you might think, but the week before September 15th, something somehow was martyred. Somebody bore witness to the truth that they espoused, and it's an interesting kind of truth. It's not the truth that I found as I've looked for the ultimate universal truth that bears the name Yahweh. And I want these episodes to have a certain timeless appeal to them. And so, on the one hand, I don't want to bind this episode too much in time. But those of you who know to look, or those of you who are listening live, which is to say, as soon as I release this on September 15th, 2025, you'll know. You'll know how timeless these issues are. From George marks the first chapter of my tradition part in God is a Grunt. There's the first part that we got done with, and that is Scripture. All the figures and the topics come out of Scripture. Then the second part, part two, I talk about tradition, and George is the first non-biblical person I'm going to cover. And George, you may know him as the patron saint of one of the world's largest empires of England. And you may have seen his white banner with a red cross on the flag of empires, of crusaders, of Knights Templars, like, which is interesting because George is a very non and anti-imperializing figure. Now, I chose George and martyrdom because martyrdom we usually associate with dying. And you'll hear from me and Dr. Eklund how, like, that's not really what martyrdom should be about. It should be about everything, about the life, the entire life, living in such a way that you bear witness to your best understanding of truth. Whatever your gods are, martyrdom is living in witness thereto. A martus in Greek was a testifier at a trial. So it's not about dying. If you're going to go out and try to die, that might be suicide. If death comes to your door and you do not slam the door in its face, and bearing witness to the truth requires that that door stay open and you are killed, you're also a martyr. So George and martyrdom and the imperial co-option, uh, uh, appropriation of Christian symbolism should be so apparent in George. And this icon that I've made, George has his own shredded flag of St. George behind him. It's in shreds. Imperialism is on the run. But he's also holding a folded American flag, which you would receive if you had a military funeral. And George was in the military a long time ago, before the dragon crap and everything else. He was a man, a soldier, and he was killed. And he was killed over and over and over again in these early, like, hyperbolic lives of the saints. George is known for how many times he's killed and how many creative ways the devil kills him. Christ resurrects him. He dies again because George alone is not afraid of death. If there's anything you can say about George, he's not afraid of death. And that's what it means to bear witness to the truth that not only death has been conquered, but that it's not even death that we seek. It is to be good. And should death come to our door and challenge us and try and keep us from being good, then yeah, you might be killed as a martyr. But we're all martyrs insofar as we testify to the truth in which we believe. So without further ado, here is Rebekah Eklund of Loyola Marymount College. And I'm really struck by this conversation. It's a wonderful conversation, and I won't say too much more about it. Only just really quickly at the very end, you'll notice I do something. I don't intend to have the last word. I know how important it is to speak directly from experience, to reassure others who have a specific experience. And Rebecca has not served. And that is why I want to front load this. It's not a trigger warning or whatever, but like, Dr. Eklund is just such a good conversation. I don't want to downplay her expertise in what seems like I'm going to try and have the last word. You'll get there. I think it will make sense. Here is Dr. Rebekah Eklund and myself talking about George and martyrdom. Hope you enjoy. We're here with Rebekah Eklund of Loyola in Chicago. There's several Loyolas. Dr. Eklund, would you
Oh,
remind us where
yes.
you're at and what your field is?
Yeah, so I'm at the Loyola in Maryland, actually. I'm Loyola University Maryland in Baltimore. There are lots of Loyolas. My Loyola is proud that we were the first one.
Ah, okay.
Anyway, my field is New Testament and ethics. That's my specialty. But because I teach undergrads, I teach a little bit of everything, which is super fun.
Nice. Yeah, I love the ability to kind of stick with with scripture, but be able to be enough of a specialist in something, whether it's ethics. Like it'd be interesting to just be a Bible scholar and not something else on the side. Maybe I'm just a cynic, but we're here to talk today about St. George of Lydda, St. George of England. George, the Knight of Cappadocia, has been named as a patron saint of England and other empires, which is funny because the oldest cycle of his vidas and his life have him as a soldier who refuses in some way to do something that the empire doesn't like. And there's a whole string of them. In another chapter, I talk about hagiography using Martin of Tours. But today we're talking about martyrdom. And I'd like you to say a little bit about how you came to this, what your ethical kind of perspective is. If you want to introduce your work on the Beatitudes, I'd love to hear what brings you to this conversation and what social location do you kind of most identify with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I came to this via my work on the Beatitudes. So I wrote a book called The Beatitudes Through the Ages, which explores how the Beatitudes have been understood and interpreted throughout Christian history. So the Beatitudes are those blessings that Jesus gives right at the start of the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the
Hmm.
poor, or the poor in spirit, depending on if you're looking at Matthew or Luke's version. And I became really interested at one point in how they have like changed in meaning and function over time, or how they've stayed stable in meaning and function over time. So I decided somewhat overambitiously to read my way through 2,000 years of history. But I would say actually there's three Beatitudes that sort of pertain to the question of martyrdom, and a figure like St. George. And the first one is meekness. And so before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about language and kind of how things change in translation. And meekness, I think, is the best example of that, because the word meek, I think, in English suggests sort of timidity or
Hmm.
but in Greek, it's like this powerful virtue of self-control. It's being able to rightly shape and use your anger. So
Hmm.
that's kind of one element. And
What is
then
the word in Greek?
yeah, it's praus.
Okay.
And it can also be translated gentleness,
Hmm.
which I like better, because we still actually use gentle as a verb with like wild
Hmm.
horses, right? To gentle a horse.
Oh, okay.
And I think that's a great kind of metaphor for what gentling is in the Greek, in praus. It's the virtue of, not that you never get angry, but you get angry at the right things for the right reasons, in the
Hmm.
right amount, for the right length of time. And I think anger is, anyway, I mean, it comes into play in a lot of ways, right? But
Yeah.
certainly in relation to violence. The chapter on blessed are the peacemakers. I fell down an interesting little rabbit hole. I know you talked to George Kalantzis, who's like the expert on this in terms of Christian attitudes towards soldiers. So I used some of his work, but also looked at Augustine and the development of the just war theory and the whole question of, to be a peacemaker, can you be involved in war at all?
Hmm.
And, if in the Christian tradition, if peace is preferable, if peace is the goal, can you use force to achieve peace? Or
Hmm.
can you participate in violent efforts in order to be a peacemaker? And then the chapter on Blessed are the persecuted, where you get then into martyrdom and
Hmm.
into, the sort of martyrs as the persecuted. And I think the main question there is the blessing for those who are persecuted for the sake of Jesus, for the sake of the Son of Man, as one of the Beatitudes says. So it's only blessed if you're martyred for, you know, in the traditional sense, right? For
Hmm.
refusing to renounce your Christian faith. But there's also a beatitude that says, Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness or for the sake of justice, because the Greek word dikaiosune can mean both, right? It gets rendered
Yeah.
into English either as justice or righteousness. So there's kind of this more modern debate about whether people who may or may not be Christians, if they are persecuted or martyred for doing justice, for doing justly, is this also a kind of part of the blessing of the Beatitude? So that was a little bit of a long,
No, I think
but
that's
that both all three of those Beatitudes are kind of how I enter into this chapter.
yeah, I think when you talked about meekness in contrast to anger situated in its relationship to anger, that's one of the pieces that has kind of been rolling around in my head as a soldier. Um, and Augustine was not a soldier, so he's reflecting
Mhm.
on these things through a certain several degrees of separation. And and so I'm aware of, and I'm, kind of, I have been in contact with those who are formed by Augustine and who think either that I can kill someone without feeling anger,
Mm,
um, or that anger is the only thing that allows for anger. I'm sorry, anger is the only thing that allows for violence. There's an Orthodox guy I listened to before I got to Duke who said, just insensitively, that we know all soldiers go to war out of bloodlust.
oh
And he
my.
said it kind of tongue in cheek, but he didn't not mean it. And I heard that
Mm,
after 6 years in the military, getting ready to go to seminary.
mm,
And I thought, if that's what theologians think, that doesn't match with my 6 years in the military. Either I'm wrong or he's wrong.
mm-hmm,
And my association or my experience of anger seems much more nuanced than I've heard civilian theologians reflect on.
mm,
And meekness and peacemaking, I think, I'll say anger. We always go to Jesus flipping the tables. And that's a kind of overt act. It seems like it was street theater. He went there, I think, in Mark, and nobody was there. So he comes back the next day. But I think there's a lot more anger, or earlier you said righteousness, persecuted for the sake of righteousness. I am aware that in the Greek, uh, the Sadducees, were calling themselves righteous ones, Zadokites, or they were taking the imagery of the Zadokite dynasty, which had ended under the Maccabean era, and saying,
mm-hmm.
"Oh, now we're the new Zadokites. We're the
Yeah.
ones who are the inheritors of the high priesthood. We are the righteous ones." And Jesus and all his contemporaries are like, "No, Herod destroyed Joshua's temple, built a new one, and now you're just trying to get in good with Herod." So when he says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted on behalf of
Mm,
Zadok," or the Hebrew and Greek doesn't quite line up, but it seems like
mm-hmm.
there's
Yeah,
something
it's
there.
there's an overlap there for sure.
Yeah, I wonder if
Yeah,
there's,
yeah, interesting.
and uh, as a homemaker who's been a stay-at-home dad for 8 years and who has to deal with children, anger seems to be dangerous. Anger seems to be something that,
Mm,
the whole gentle parenting movement would suggest that when I raise my voice or when I express anger, that that's harmful. And
mm,
I think that it's more nuanced than that.
yeah.
When I'm angry, it drives me to do things to correct what's wrong. Martin Luther King
Mm-hmm.
said, he was asked by a reporter, um, what would you say to those who think you're just really, an angry black man? And Martin said, well, it's not that we're not angry, it's that we channel our anger toward justice. And
Right, right. Yeah. And I think that's the piece about so earlier where we might also end up talking about virtue ethics, which is part of this chapter. And with virtue ethics, it's always like a mean between an extreme and a
right,
deficiency, right? And
yeah,
the deficiency of the virtue of meekness is actually not getting angry at the things you're
mm,
supposed to get angry at,
hmm
right? It's this kind of like, meh. And so, not getting angry at things that should make you angry is a deficiency in that kind of way of understanding what meekness is. So,
yeah. And I think as a veteran, I'm also aware like these generational changes, like my dad and my partner's dad were providers. That's what was expected of them.
mhm.
But at home, both of our moms they had experienced the women's liberation movement and early feminism, and I'm absolute speculation. I'm not a woman, I'm not them, but like my sense is they got a sense of what more freedom was like, but they didn't have quite as much as they deserved. And in varying ways, I think my partner would agree with my speculative assessment that there's a certain amount of anger or resentment at, look,
Mm,
I don't want just a provider, I want a partner. And because of, hers and my social location and our upbringing and experience, we're trying to be better. I'm not just a provider. I've got 100% disability, so I've got some financial flexibility, but like, I'm not here to just, shovel resources in to my family. It's like being a partner means something more.
yeah.
Um, and I think the anger piece and how it's masculinized can be
Mm,
seen as a liability or a threat because we haven't really done the work to understand what it means to be emotionally nourished. Like
Yeah.
I think of, I won't say any names, but I was in the nonprofit world for a long time. I'm still basically there. But there's one or two fundraisers that I think of, and I think they have to put on smiles all the time. And that seems to me to be emotional malnourishment. We're not getting enough of what
Mm.
God has given us in our bones and our being. There's a way to take anger way too far.
Yeah.
But if we don't have
There's
anger,
an
if we're
excess.
always
There's an excess and a deficiency.
exactly, there's the golden mean of, I mean, and there's also a series of virtues that, all must align for a person to be magnanimous, etc.
Hmm.
But anyway, let's get back to martyrdom.
Yeah.
Um, I also want to talk about the etymology of it. Martus being
Yeah.
a witness at a trial. Caiaphas says it at the trial with Jesus, saying when he can't find counter testimony, which I think I bring this up in the book. He says,
Hmm. Yeah.
why do we need any martoi? Why do we need any more testimonies?
Yeah. We've heard it from his own mouth. Like we
Yeah,
have enough.
exactly. And thinking about what function Christ serves in God reconciling the world to God's self, it strikes me that bearing witness, that suffering death as a seal of your faith is one
Mm.
kind of bearing witness. But when Paul says, like, pray ceaselessly, that strikes me as like, what does it mean to allow the entirety of your life, everything you do to bear witness to the truth that we see in
Hmm.
Christ? And
Hmm.
Stephen, the first martyr, really seems to take, I don't know, I want to think through whether there's fruit to be had in thinking of martyrs as not just those who are killed. And here again, I have like Martin, my patron saint, and the namesake of the Hospitality of Saint Martin. In the fourth century, he's recruited into the Praetorian Guard under Caesar Julian, who, according to some accounts, had had two soldiers, Juventinus and Maximinus, killed for doing almost what he did, which is to refuse to fight or to refuse to pinch incense to Caesar. And in 356 or so, he's been in the Praetorian Guard for years, protecting Caesar's life. And he comes to this moment where, for the first time, as far as we can tell, he's told to go to war for Caesar. And
Mm.
he says no. And all these other military saints had been martyred. Juventus Maximinus, George, if some of his cycle had already been appearing, and magically or whatever, he escapes martyrdom, and he goes on to become a bishop and found all these communities, become the reluctant bishop of a major see and tour. And so I want to kind of trouble the idea that martyrdom equals self-sacrifice to death, but that
Hmm.
it must also mean something before death. Like
Hmm. Hmm.
if the martyrdom, white martyrdom, is the seal of the faith, there's these other martyrdoms or the essence of martyrdom that must obviously um, erupt in one's life, such that when the moment comes, like Stephen, he knew there's nothing that he could do but suffer the fate that the world had for him. Just
Yeah.
like Martin didn't decide not to die. And I'll just say one more thing, that through the military lens, and I did put this in the book, there's this caricature, this Lieutenant Dan from Forrest Gump.
Yeah.
He wants to die because
Hmm.
that is the most assured way of being a virtuous person, to die on the field of battle. The Greeks, the Romans, and he's deprived of that. And when soldiers are deprived of what they think the virtuous act is, you can have these, your soul can become disordered. Like
Hmm.
Lieutenant Dan, he thought that
Hmm.
the only way that he could be good was to die in battle.
Yeah.
Martin may have felt the same way. Maybe George felt the same way, but we can't choose it. And that seems to be the
Hmm.
distinction between suicide and martyrdom.
Right.
Can we talk a little bit about the context that leads to martyrdom? We can talk about Irenaeus of Lyon or Polycarp, but I want to make sure that as Christians, as believers, we don't put death
Mm.
or the honorable death above the honorable life. The honorable life is it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
if
No,
you're killed because
yeah,
you're living honorably, then hey, good on you.
yeah,
But we sometimes we put that
yeah,
above, we put the chariot before the horse, and that becomes, these martyrdom complexes where we play the victim, but if it
yeah.
really comes to suffering, we're going to run.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I totally agree. I think if you think about in the book of Acts, what Jesus, well, at the end of Luke and at the start of Acts, what Jesus commissions his followers to do is to be my witnesses. And if you
mm,
think about the word, martyr being derived from the word witnesses, he basically says, go be my martyrs. But by that, he does not mean all of you go and die for me,
yeah,
right? That's not the goal. The goal is to go witness for me. And that witness might be costly. It
yeah,
might cost you your job, or it might cause tensions in your family if you're in a Jewish family and you've decided to follow Jesus and your family members think you're now a heretic.
yeah,
It might, in fact, your faithful witness might cause you to get thrown in jail, like Paul, or it might lead to your death. But the goal
mm,
is not that, right? The goal is to be a witness for Jesus wherever you happen to be. And so I like this idea of like the focus on the sort of honorable life rather than the honorable death. And of course, you mentioned in the chapter that there is this sort of tension that some people glorified martyrdom so much that they actually sought it out. And this was
yeah,
officially frowned upon, right? The church was like, no,
yeah,
because, you're made in the image of God. You don't get to try to kill yours. You don't get to throw your
yeah,
life away like that. But if the time came where your witness um, requires you to die because either you have a choice, either to stand up and witness for Christ, and that witness is going to get you killed, then that's going to lead to your death, right? I think of Perpetua. You mentioned,
mm,
Irenaeus and Polycarp, and so I teach the martyrdom of Perpetua,
mm,
partially because it's the oldest existing text written in the voice of a Christian woman. So I love to teach it for that reason. She was martyred along with another woman named
Felicita,
Felicity
yeah,
and several other people. Their catechist, their teacher,
mm,
Satyrus, in the year 203 in Carthage in North Africa. And I love to teach this text because she and some of her fellow catechism students essentially are arrested and they're in jail with their teacher, with Satyrus, who's their catechist, their instructor in the faith.
mm,
We know that Perpetua is very young. I think she's like 20, 21,
mm,
22. Um, and so she's just being instructed in the faith. She's a new Christian. And her father goes to beg with her to renounce her faith or to lie or do anything, bribe, get out of this situation and live. She has a newborn child.
mm,
And so the father's like, how could you possibly abandon your newborn child by dying? You can save yourself, save yourself. And she basically tells her father, look at that jug over there. Is that water jug a chair? Is it a table? Is it anything other than a jug? And he said, no, that's a jug. And she said, well, I'm a Christian. And that is what I am. I cannot be other than what I am.
mm,
And so if that means that I'm going to die, then I'm going to, because simply have no other choice. It's not that she wants to die. It's, she weeps over, being separated from her infant but she just says, I'm a Christian, full stop. And if the price of not renouncing that is my death, then I'm going to die. And she has these visions where she's given these visions that through her willingness to die for Christ, she actually defeats Satan. That it is through her death that she achieves this victory over the devil. So it's this kind of wonderful reconfiguration of like what is happening to her in the arena. She's not dying.
yeah.
I mean, she is, but she's actually defeating Satan through her willingness to stand up for her faith in Christ.
Yeah, and it brings us back to George because I think like the the stylized George killing the dragon, killing the devil,
Yeah.
that's hinted at in some of the early ones, like he just dies over and over again and he's
Right. Right.
resurrected
Yeah.
and blah blah blah. Like it's all about dying for Christ. But I also, back to the golden mean, like moderation and everything. I've even as I read some of these martyr stories and I hear from there are vets, um, there are stories, no shortage of stories of veterans who take their own life and
Hmm.
tell themselves and their family that I'm a burden. I want to relieve
Mm,
that burden on
mm,
you. And that's
mm.
a kind of a lie,
Yeah.
but that it seems to follow the same imaginative trajectory of I'm bearing witness. Death has lost its sting. Like it's
Mm,
such a fine line
yeah.
between, and it's not suicide, but it's like I want to say to Perpetua and George, like you can choose to let the world do that to you, but you can also choose to run, and that is you can live a good life. It's it's so difficult to. I think maybe what I'm suggesting is that I think that the freedom of Christ is the freedom to to say yes or to say no. And if you're
Mm,
moved by
yeah.
the Spirit, as Perpetua was, as George was, as Maximilian Tebessa, like do it. And people will tell you no. Like Franz Jagerstatter in World War II, like everybody was telling him, "Don't do this thing." And now we look back and the Catholic Church has venerated him like to think if everybody just said no to run and live another day, as a lot of people were telling Irenaeus of Lyon as he was moving off to Rome, like I think it's such a hard, there's no way to say one thing or another. It
Yeah.
has to rest on one's inspiration or conscience and connection to God. We're going to take a break really quick, but I think this sets up the third beatitude that you talked about in peacemaking. When we come back from the break, I want to hear about what the Greek kind of context is behind that and what that kind of points toward in if we believe that following Christ is about the honorable life, which doesn't exclude the honorable death, but doesn't center it. I think that's what makes me nervous, that certain perspectives put martyrdom as death on the pedestal, and I can't
Hmm.
have that thingy, but maybe if I make myself suffer. I thought
Mm,
of
mm,
like
yeah.
Francis of Assisi, which I talked about in another chapter about pilgrimage being an anti-crusade. He goes to the Sultan thinking he's gonna die, and again he doesn't. And towards the end of his life, he has the stigmata, etc. But like, there's something good in wanting to follow the Spirit to dangerous places.
Hmm.
But when the fates or God or the universe don't align and you don't get killed for the faith, what does it mean to live faithfully, to
Yeah.
make the kind of life and presence that God instilled or inaugurated in Christ? What does that mean when like death is not the destination, but it may be a spot along the way?
Yeah, and
Um,
still to be a great witness. I mean, there's, you know this, but there's actual treatises written in the early Christian tradition about whether you're allowed to run from
yeah,
persecution. And some Christians said, of course you are, absolutely. And we know that some Christians ran, some hid,
yeah,
and these were not seen as dishonorable choices. I mean, I suppose
yeah,
some might
yeah.
have, but they were seen as you can be a witness if you're alive. I guess the other, I know we're going to a break, but the other question that I come back to that you asked in your chapter, which is such a good question, is what is worth dying for?
Mm,
And I have military people in my family. My stepmom was a veteran. My grandfather fought in the Navy in World War II. So I don't have any personal experience, but I definitely have family members who had that personal experience. And I guess I would want to tell them, again, I can't speak from my own experience, but like you're not a burden. I mean, nobody
yeah,
like dying because you think you're a burden is not a good. I can
yeah,
understand why someone would feel that way and that they're making a sacrifice, but people aren't burdens, right?
yeah, yeah. Well,
Anyway.
I think that sets us up really well to, after the break, talk about what peacemaking means if we are called to live lives that do not fear death, but that create and shine forth goodness. Because I think, yeah, we can talk about Genesis all day, but we're going to be back after the
Mhm.
break with Dr. Rebekah Eklund. Thank you for listening. We'll be right back. We are back with Dr. Rebekah Eklund of Loyola University in Baltimore. We talked before the break about the difficulty of navigating the Christian life in such a way that does not fear death, but does not set up death, premature death, as a good in itself. And you would, at the beginning of this episode, you talked about these three Beatitudes that you thought were particularly useful. We talked about meekness and how it's kind of its relationship with anger and how it's not shyness or quietness, but pursuing the good in a way that doesn't let anger get out of control, but also doesn't deny it, I suppose. And we talked about persecution and martyrdom as linguistically or uh, to use a fancy word, ontologically, like it just means
Mm,
bearing witness. It's a witness at a trial, somebody who lives truthfully without concealment.
hmm
And in the military, one of the things I'm most proud of in this chapter that I came up with was survival is not a virtue; it's a form of resistance.
hmm
And
hmm
sometimes, and I say this as someone, I got out of the military as a conscience objector, kind of fought the army a little bit and got pushed out. Then I went into activisty circles and I did that kind of stuff. And like, I have been left with this sense that like peace or shalom or whatever is not something that occurs naturally. And maybe that's because of, we'll call it original sin or whatever, but Dorothy Day or Peter Morin or one of them said that we live in a society that makes it hard for people to be good. It's
mm,
easier to do
mm,
evil. It's easier to,
yeah.
keep up with the Joneses and exploit any resources you can to get just a little bit closer to the top of the ladder. And peacemaker or peacemaking in a lot of the conversations that I found myself in as I was getting out and since, with ethics and evangelicalism, it's like, there's this positivist bent, like it's not peacekeeping, even though keeper, shamar is really important in Genesis. What is
hmm
peacemaker or peacemaking in the Beatitudes in Luke? And does it, how does it comport with the kind of popularized understanding of, hey, we're all peacemakers sing Kumbaya or something? Like, where is that
Yeah.
tension and where do you find the most fertile kind of ground for talking about what peacemaking can really, what's possible with peacemaking?
Yeah, it's such a good question. This was an interesting chapter for me to kind of dig into because it's the one I feel like that had the most variety in terms of what peacemaking looks like
Mm,
from from making peace with God, making peace with yourself. I encountered a lot of writers, which I found very interesting, who said the first person you have to make peace with is yourself.
yeah,
Because if you are not yourself a peaceful person or a person at peace with yourself, how can you expect to make peace among other people? I found that really interesting and kind of convicting.
yeah,
Um, and then, peace with the household, peace just in the domestic relationships, peace in neighborhoods, peace in friendships,
hmm
peace among churches, um, peace like sort of across denominations, like Christians feeling called to be peacemakers across,
hmm
Orthodox and Catholic and Protestant lines. And then peace making sort of a national or international scale. So it goes from like the very smallest, like one person, all the way up to nations. And I found
hmm
that as such an interesting kind of way to think about it, that we might jump immediately to things like war or nations, but that it also has these very small, like personal components, which are really just as important.
hmm
And if you think about the word, peace in Greek, it's eirene, but it overlaps. It's probably a translation of this Hebrew word shalom, which a lot of
hmm
people are familiar with, which obviously means more than simply the absence of conflict, right?
hmm
It's this word that means wholeness or flourishing, where you have all the conditions that you need in order to be whole, both as a person, but also as a society, as a
right.
family, as a neighborhood, as a nation. So it's this very deep concept, do you have everything you need to flourish? Do I have everything I need to flourish? Do we have everything we need to flourish together? Where the weakest or most vulnerable members are not sort of left out, that they're taken into account.
Hmm.
And to me, that helped me sort of reorient what peacemaking was away from just the issue of war, which clearly is part of it, but that
Hmm.
it also has all these other dimensions to it. I don't know, I could say a lot more, but I'll let you respond.
Yeah, it makes me think of man, Dan. Oh, I cannot remember his last name, but he was one of Stanley's students. Um, Just War's Christian Discipleship.
Hmm.
I can't remember his last name.
I
But
can't
there
either.
was the first thing that struck me is like, yeah, if war is a last resort in the Augustinian framework, the only thing keeping us on that path is a lack of imagination, an inability to legitimately pursue the the context or the circumstances for being a just people. Like peace, yeah, the peacemaking. It makes me think of like the Department of Defense. It used to be the Department of War, is just more honest, and now we call it
Yeah,
Department of Defense. And peacekeeping with the blue helmets in the UN, like
yeah.
let's lower the temperature, but how how much conflict can we tolerate to keep the ships from rocking?
Hmm.
And one of the things, so I've as a stay-at-home, my last chapter in this book was on Ralph Abernathy and the black veterans who laid the foundation for Martin, a civilian, to lead this movement of black liberation and civil rights. And I can't say I made the chapter about Ralph Abernathy because Ralph, not only was Ralph a veteran, and there's this saying that I talked about in an earlier episode with David Peters. The Civil War veterans had a way of talking about combat, and they would call it, "Did you see the elephant?" You know, we all talk about, "Did you talk about the elephant in the room? Did you see
Yeah.
the elephant? Did you kill someone? Were you
Ah.
asked to do something that you knew
Mm.
on some level was wrong, and has that shaped who you are? Did you see the
Yeah.
elephant?" Martin never saw the
Mm.
elephant,
Yeah. Yeah.
and Ralph did, and he actually he saw combat in the European theater in a black unit, and he developed typhoid, I think, and he got medically not discharged, but he got put on medical leave in Germany. His entire unit, which is just so messed up, black unit was trained to go to the European theater. They moved into the Pacific theater where they were just annihilated, and he lost
Oh,
everybody in his unit.
wow.
And that there's something there's something about seeing the cost of our privilege and an entitlement. There's something about our society now that has no conscription, that the people who are forced to bear the weight of this cost of our American freedom, we don't know how to have these conversations with them because they've seen the
Hmm.
elephant, and that's
Hmm.
uncomfortable. It's scary.
Yeah.
But if you want to have peace, if you want to make peace, at least even on some like strategic level, you have to have seen the enemy. You have to
Hmm.
know not just, in the Pauline, like not flesh and blood, but like what is the enemy? The enemy is arrogance, egotism, entitlement. And what does it mean to be on guard against that?
Hmm.
And when I talk about Martin, I have to stop myself because we all know there are certain ways in which he didn't meet the moment. Not publicly, but Ralph got into a lot of trouble because I should, I don't know how to narrate this other than to just keep talking about Ralph. Because we make our saints and we put them up on pedestals and we name roadways after them, which is something that was done to Martin and something that's done with veterans. Instead of
Hmm.
listening, instead of
Hmm.
doing the difficult work, which we may not even know what that difficult work is if we haven't seen the challenges that we have to overcome, we make these whitewashed saints. And Martin has this big sandstone white statue in DC. And like
Hmm.
that is the product of a white imagination. And
Hmm.
I would have loved to have seen uh, a generation or two prior treat veterans in a way that recognized that they carry something that society needs.
Yeah.
That if we want peace, if we want justice, if we want shalom, like we have to be willing to look at those dark spots. We have to be willing, like I one of my chapters, well, I can't remember which one, Joshua in policing. Joshua, Moses' assistant, he led this military campaign in Canaan, and he oversaw the allotment of land. That's the same English name for the Messiah.
Yeah.
Like in the fourth century, Jerome just decided he wanted to differentiate one Yehoshua from another. The Greeks still say Yehoshua ben Nun, Yehoshua ben Miriam, and they're the same. But in the
Hmm.
West, we have created something that allows us to look past all that military stuff and Judges and Joshua. And so we have this weird faith that can't see that dark stuff.
Hmm.
Um, in your experience, academically or otherwise, what does it look like, or how does your faith or the tradition that you most identify with, what does it mean, or what do you think it takes to make peace?
Hmm.
And without getting too much into our own, like I said before I started recording, I want these to be kind of timeless. It's too easy to get into specific current events,
Yeah.
but what do you think peacemaking is in our day? And what do we need? What are there missing pieces? And if so, like, what does it look like to do that today?
Oh, I wish I knew. I mean, my goodness. But I guess just going back briefly to your point about our distance. I mean, obviously, as a civilian, like I feel very distant from the experience of people who have gone to war. I
Hmm.
mean, the people I know most closely are either in my parents' generation or my grandparents' generation. Like I'm not friends with anyone in my generation who has gone to war, which is kind of astonishing if you think about it. If you think about how many people are soldiers or in the National Guard or but what does it take to make peace today? I mean, part of me just wants to throw up my hands and go, how can we? The problems are so deeply entrenched. But then I think, no, this is part of what we're called to, right? Christians are called to the ministry of reconciliation. And I
Hmm.
think part of what that means is reconciliation is a kind of form of peacemaking, right? Reconciling people to one another. And that might be at a rather small level. It might not be, well, we're going to solve the current wars that are raging around the world, but we might begin to be able to reconcile people to one another who can't see eye to eye. And one of the things that's influenced me in terms of what peacemaking looks like in the world today on a bigger scale are these kind of they're variously called like peace building movements or
Yeah.
I cannot remember what Lisa Sal Cahill calls this. She has a book on this, and I've utterly, my apologies to her, I've utterly forgotten what term uses. But this idea that we often think of peacemaking as intervening in a conflict that's already in progress,
Hmm.
um, or that once like the war is ended, then the work of peacemaking is done. But and other practitioners as well say, well, peacemaking is in large part, the most important part of it is trying to build the conditions where war doesn't break out or where violence
Yeah.
doesn't break out. So, what does a neighborhood or a society need to be more stable so that you don't need to send troops in to
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and I think that's a piece that is hugely important, that pre-work, I think like asset-based community development thinks about this, right? Where rather than going to a neighborhood or a city and saying, here are all your problems and we are going to fix them for you, asset-based community development goes in and says, what are your strengths and how can we help you build on them? And I think that's a I don't know, it's much less paternalistic in one sense. You're not
Yeah.
coming in as the sort of savior to save, but also like, what are your strengths? What are your beauties as a community? What do you love about yourselves? And are there resources you currently lack that you need to build on those strengths? I mean, that to me, that's a form of peacemaking, because
Yeah.
it's a form of helping a community not tip over to the point where they need armed intervention. Or and then peace building is also what happens in the aftermath of a conflict, right? Rebuilding infrastructure, rebuilding the health system,
Mm,
helping people, neighbors who might have fought on opposite sides of a war. How do they now live together?
yeah.
And I think that's also part of peacemaking. Again, I'm not speaking of this as like a practitioner necessarily, right? I'm an academic,
Yeah.
so I feel a little humbled by trying to say what I think peacemaking looks like, but from what I have studied.
Yeah, it brings me back to George and how George has been used. He is the
Mm,
patron saint of an empire, or it
yeah,
was, depending how you. Anyway, like
right. Yeah,
these stories will get co-opted the further
yeah.
they grow from the source. And my discomfort around Martin was that they knew Martin and Ralph both knew they needed an audience to show white moderates that it's really happening. We're not
Mm,
making this stuff up.
yeah,
They knew they needed TV crews. They knew they needed talented speakers, and
yep.
Martin supplied that. But the further it got from the source, because they went from first with Montgomery, then Albany, New York, and then Birmingham, like they kind of went up and down, and they were community organizers first. And it
Hmm.
strikes me that maybe one of the connections, the ligaments to this is like George, don't forget that George is a real person. Like it's like King Arthur. Like we
Yeah.
know the dragon, but like if you don't know the Golden Legend and then Caxton's reinterpretation to include the dragon, like the further that these sources get from their primary source, the more embellished and whitewashed they can get. And I think
Yeah.
that's what troubles me is that you need a certain amount of attention or influence to make a difference in our attention economy world.
Yeah.
And peacemaking, it strikes me like at some point I had this thought, the starving child in India. That if you're so concerned about the starving children in India that you can't realize that there's people who are sleeping on the streets, like maybe the cosmopolitan kind of instinct of empire has seeped into your own imagination. Maybe
Mm,
you need to like
yeah.
sit down, plant some roots, and I have this phrase I use with friends, slow activism. It was
Mm,
actually Amy Laura
yeah.
Hall. There's a panel some years ago when I think you and I were both at Duke. I can't remember what it was, but there was some conversation, and either she said it or I like asked a question and said, well, maybe activism is raising children well and
Mm,
tending to yourself and tending to your own community first and foremost. It feels selfish, but like if you can't get yourself right, that's it's an unsteady foundation.
yeah. Peace with
Um,
yourself first, right?
yeah, yeah. Which
Tend your
is
garden.
exactly. And as the military, we had this thing, self-aid first. If it's like the oxygen mask, there's a reason they
Mm.
tell you help someone else first. And that exact reason is hypoxia won't kill you right away, but if it will kill you. So put your own mask on, and while everybody else is going to sleep, then you put their mask on and you help more
And save
people.
them.
It's
Yeah.
like counterintuitive, but that's the way it works. You start with yourself, which feels so selfish and weird, but like it's true. If you
Yeah.
don't have a good relationship with yourself or with God, like all these other things can just go haywire.
Yeah, I mean, like,
Um,
John Wesley in his sermon on loving your neighbor says the first neighbor you are called to love is yourself. Now, it does not
that's good.
stop with yourself,
Yeah,
right? Because then you've just become self-centered.
yeah,
But that if you give and give and give and pour yourself out and you don't treat yourself like a
yeah,
neighbor who deserves to be loved, then you're just going to burn out. I mean,
yeah,
John Wesley did not say that, but I think,
yeah,
that's it's kind of part of the idea, right? And
yeah.
everyone has their own garden to tend.
Hmm.
I mean, I used to be just all tied up in knots when I was younger that I should be doing something more like I should join Doctors Without Borders or
Hmm.
something. And I would be a terrible doctor. I mean, I would genuinely be a terrible doctor. I sympathy puke. I mean, if anyone else near me is puking, I puke. I would be a terrible doctor. But
Yeah,
like, I think I've found my garden. I think that I've found, God willing, where I can use the gifts that God has given me, and I do my best, not often, succeeding, but I do my best to live out the Beatitudes in my own life, in my own garden, right? To be a
Yeah.
peacemaker where I can and contribute where I can. And yeah,
Yeah.
and that's
Moderation in
what
everything.
witness is, right? I presume that I'll never be asked to die for my faith. If I was, I hope that I'd be brave enough to do it. But I presume that my faithful witness will just be kind of living, tending my little patch of garden.
Yeah. Um, yeah, back just to close with virtue ethics, like it took me a long time, yeah, to realize it wasn't selfish to care for myself.
Mm,
And my partner, a lot of this language is learned, but it's up to you to practice it. She's really good about encouraging me to take self-care. For me, that's physical, skating, surfing, um, running errands, something. And that's, shaped, by my gender and everything else. But it took a long time to realize like what it really means that I bear the image of God in myself. And if
yeah,
if I'm not bearing witness to the goodness of myself, then yeah, it's the chain link effect is going to like eventually begin to crumble.
yeah,
But I mentioned virtue ethics like moderation, everything. You can love yourself without being selfish.
yep,
Um,
yep.
and as difficult as it is, yeah, it's a supreme tragedy that military service and combat service convinces people of the lie that their lives aren't worth very much and that they'd be
Yeah.
better as not as a burden. And
Right,
it's
right.
um
That's a horrible tragedy. Can I just say something really quick about
yeah,
the image of God thing and the
absolutely.
so my absolute favorite thing that I stumbled on upon in all of my research on the Beatitudes was this interpretation of what the Beatitude, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God means.
Mm,
And there's one interpretation that's just like a few people, it's not a big one, but it's just a few people who say, if you are pure in heart enough, if you're clean enough, if your eyes are clean enough, your soul is clean enough, you will see God by being able to recognize the image of God in yourself and in everyone else you encounter.
mm,
And that this your purity of heart, that's the blessing you get. You can recognize yourself as made in the image of God, and you see your own deep value, and you can look at every other person you meet and say that person is also made in the image of God. Now they may be deeply broken and they may be, really tarnished by the fall. They may be an actually horrible person, but deep down in them, somewhere they have the spark of the image of God, and that you get to see that if you're pure enough to see it. I just loved that. And I again, I don't always live up to that, but I try. When I go to the grocery store, I'm like, look at all these beautiful images of God walking around buying their
mm.
groceries.
Yeah. And it feels self-righteous, but like the people who are the most troubled have the most to gain by being reminded that God is within them. And
Yes,
that's I think
absolutely.
that's our I think that's what peacemaking is like
Yeah.
once you discover what it means to bear witness to the truth in your very being,
Hmm.
the next step is how do you help other people do that?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Absolutely. That's a lovely definition of peacemaking.
well, I think there's no better time to stop than when I've said something good and important. Do you have any last words of inspiration, hope for our listeners before we sign off?
I think that's a great place to end. I think the idea of just being reminded that, especially if you're someone who struggles to see that, like you are precious and made in God's image and nothing can change that. And hopefully, to have the ability to see that in other folks as well. So
Yeah. And just aware of my audience, if you need a veteran, a combat veteran to hear that from, I can only second it. You are beloved by God. I know I've been through a lot and I know it. And if you need someone to remind you, find a friend, find a partner, hell, find me online. But Dr. Eklund, thank you for being on this episode. I look forward to hopefully having you on in the future.
love
Such a
that.
wonderful conversation. Thank you.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much.